The societal change we've gone through in the last decade or two is massive. A lot more pressure is placed on the parents, and if you don't allow fathers to take on more of that pressure, you're breaking mothers and you're excluding fathers who want to be there.
Is that because men don't advocate for themselves very well?
You need a society-wide systemic change. We want to change paternity leave because it is good for women as well as good for men. Women lose out massively from the fact that they are saddled as the primary caregiver by default. About 75% of the gender pay gap now is caused by motherhood.
We're seeing with the birth rates dropping, people are just opting out of having kids.
We've got to a place now where it's so expensive to have children that people who want to have children don't do it because they can't afford it. I think that is something that should really concern us as a society.
So welcome back, listeners. Welcome back to another episode on a topic I haven't talked about as much as, I know some people have asked me to talk more about fatherhood, and it's something that's going to be coming. There's going to be plenty of conversations about that coming up. But today I have with a man who is part of an organization that is really trying to shift in itself, like how we see fatherhood and particularly how we see paternity leave for men, because I've been through the experience of being a man who runs his own business and being offered an appalling 2 weeks paternity pay and actually never seeing it, never actually landing in my bank account, actually to this day, which I should follow up my accountant about. But today we have Alex from Dad Shift. How are you doing, Alex?
Yeah, good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Great. I'd like to just dive into the conversation because I think the first question that's on my mind is, I guess, what was the kind of catalyst or the moment for you that you realized that you needed to birth Dad Shift for you? Was it like a personal experience? Was it something difficult or something you just witnessed, or was it just like a slow burn? I'm just super curious to that.
Yeah, so I have a 3-year-old son. We've got another one on the way in August, actually. And I always, for years and years, I knew I wanted to be a dad, and I knew when I became a dad, I wanted to be really hands-on, involved, and have a really strong relationship with my son or daughter. And that was always important to me because I saw that my dad didn't get that when we were younger. He obviously, of his generation, there was no paternity leave. So right from the beginning, my elder brother was born 9:00 on a Sunday night. My dad was back at work 9 a.m. the next day. And he worked in a stressful job, long hours, lots of commuting. So we didn't really see him 5 days a week. He wasn't really involved in looking after us. And as a result, he ended up sort of pushed to the periphery of the family. And over years, that cemented. And in the end, it partly cost him his marriage. And we're much closer now when we're as adults. And he's a very, almost to my surprise, like a very soppy, devoted granddad to my son, and he'll do anything to get a smallest laugh, like dance to Teletubbies or whatever, and he's great. And it's given us a lens to start talking about how did he experience us being smaller, and the fact that he couldn't be that involved, and he feels like he sort of profoundly misses out, like he really regrets it. And that's something I always had a sense growing up. We never really talked about it. It's like I feel like he's missed something here in his life that's really important, and I didn't want to miss it. And so I am a very involved father. My wife and I do things as equally as we can, both so that I have that relationship with my son, but also so that she can carry on in the career that she loves. We've been able to make it work, but in doing that, I realized just how many barriers there are to parenting in that way. To make it work, we both have employers, or I'm self-employed. She works for a company that lets her work flexibly. We are able to work from home a lot, so we can kind of juggle nursery pickup and so on. And we have 3 sets of grandparents within half an hour to make sure that we aren't saddled with completely unaffordable childcare costs. And like most people don't have those things. And it made me realize just how many men are out there experiencing what my dad probably experienced still. And so the more I looked into this, the more I read about paternity leave as one of the sort of foundational problems in that system, and came across work that organizations like Pregnant Then Screwed were doing to bring women in to campaign for that, but couldn't find any organizations bringing dads and other men into that fight. And it felt like, firstly, that's a strategic hole in the campaign. But also, in terms of one moment where it crystallized that I need to do this, I remember hearing someone on the radio, I can't remember who it was, it might have been someone from Pregnant and Screwed, saying, it's even been left up to women to campaign for better paternity leave for men. And I said, oh, that is true. Like we need to do this work, right? We need to be part of this and not allow others to fix it for us. So that's for me where the idea came from.
Yeah, that's a powerful personal story, because I think there's also like dads not being around has become this just very normal thing, I think, and I don't know how old you are, but I see for a lot of the men that I know, both through my coaching work and also my friends, we all have some story of just like a lack of presence from our fathers, whether that is they're just not around because they weren't in the family home, or as similar to yourself, where they were working so much that they just didn't get to be involved, and the infrastructure around them didn't think that their role was even important. And I think that's something that still kind of hangs in the system a bit, even with the paternity being 2 weeks. But also I kind of experienced this going through the NHS, through the pregnancy journey. I don't know what your experience with this, but almost often feeling like you're just kind of viewed as this spare extra body that's for some reason hanging around, like even not really being named or not even really being asked any actual questions about yourself even.
Yes. I remember experiencing that. I mean, we ended up doing, we had problems with fertility, so we ended up doing IVF. So even more so in that experience as a man, your involvement is very short, let's put it that way, and sort of a one-time thing. And then after that, it's sort of the magic of science and very much on the mother. So yeah, totally. Like, and I think we hear from men so often about how the sort of lack of stuff focused on supporting them there is in the system, and that's right through the antenatal process to after the birth, around mental health in particular. That's one thing we've been talking about recently in the campaign. We just did some research with Movember, the mental health charity, and we found that 45% of new fathers are experiencing multiple symptoms of postnatal depression in the first year, which I think is higher than other figures would suggest. But there's also, whenever I say that to new dads, they're like, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. Like, we all sort of know this is going on. And yet we hear stories from people saying, even one guy said, I was asked by the midwife, do you have a history of mental health problems? And I said, yes. And she said, is there a history of mental health problems in your family? And I said, yes. And she said, well, good luck. And that was it. Like, there was nothing she could do for him.
Wow.
There was no support she could point him to. And so, yeah, I think that is still part of the problem. Like, it makes total sense that women are the focus of the attention for care. Like, they're doing the bulk of the work for sure. But I think it's an example of a system, but paternity leave is part of as well, where fathers and non-birthing parents as well, the kind of second parent in that awful kind of government language, are seen as kind of optional, and is really about the primary parent. And that's actually bad for that primary parent as well as for the father or non-birthing parent.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it when you say non-birthing parent, because during my, we did antenatal classes with NCT, and there was a lesbian couple in our group. And I remember speaking to the woman there, the non-birthing partner, and she was like, we were talking about our experiences, me being a dad, her being a non-birthing partner. She was like, it's worse. She was like, because at least people look at you and go, oh yeah, of course, dad. She was like, people don't even know how to refer to me or what kind of I exist in and all sorts. And she said it was really complicated with the paternity leave, because her company were like, well, okay, we got maternity leave and we got paternity leave, and we don't know what you are. So we need some time to kind of figure this out. And she said it was just, they even particularly chose a hospital they hoped would be more, so we say, open-minded, because they'd heard stories from other friends about particular hospitals and so forth, where they were definitely not made to feel part of the birthing experience along the way.
Yeah, we are working with a group called LGBT Mummies on the campaign, and it's been really, I think it's really important that we are bringing in the voices of all the people affected by bad paternity leave. The name is really unhelpful. Like that example you gave is a classic example of, if we're the best word in the world, it's called paternity leave. It's not just for men. It's really confusing. That's like one example of problem. But also, non-birthing parents, like mums in same-sex relationships, they experience some of the same problems that we do as fathers, but they also experience some very different problems. And actually, like, there's not a ton of awareness of that out there. And I've learned a ton from talking to this organization. So yeah, I mean, what we are doing is very much a fight, not just for fathers, it's for all parents and all parents who take paternity leave. And that includes self-employed parents who are often like left out of this conversation. But we say we have the worst paternity leave in Europe, 2 weeks paid at less than half minimum wage. If you're self-employed, you get absolutely nothing. I'm self-employed at the moment. When my child arrives, I'm not going to get any paternity pay. I imagine you didn't either. And some of the stories we hear about people who are worst hit by this are people who are self-employed who say, I don't work, I don't get paid. Some people go back literally the next day because they have no other choice. And it's wild that that's how we're doing things in the 21st century in 2025.
Yeah. I've heard some stories of guys I know who run their own businesses, and if you're running your own businesses, I guess you can do some planning for it, but it is rough to think that, in these first couple of weeks, first couple of months after the baby's born, you're having to think about like work, money, income, all these sorts of things. Why do you think the system is built like this? Why do you think it's so underdeveloped in the UK? Is it kind of a cultural thing? Is it a kind of systematic belief that we have here around fatherhood? What do you think it is, or what do you come to experience that it is?
Yeah, this is a question we get asked a lot, and it's I think a really good question. The evidence I've increasingly, when we started the campaign, people ask this, and I don't really know. Like I can point to patterns. Like I think there's an interesting pattern that if you look at the OECD group of countries are basically the wealthiest countries in the world. We're right down the bottom. We're like third from the bottom or fourth from the bottom. We're the worst in Europe, but fourth in that kind of wider group. And 3 out of the 4 countries that are worse than us are all English speaking. There's Australia, New Zealand, the US, and then there's us. And then Israel is in there as a kind of outlier on that. And so I saw is that, there's something kind of there in the like Anglo-Saxon culture that we're less, we're more, we're less family focused for men. We have these kind of more rigid gender roles. And actually, maybe, but the more I've gone on, the more evidence that I've seen that what we have is a political inaction problem. It's not a problem with our values as a country. So, for example, one of the polling questions we put out is, do you agree that these days fathers want to be a bigger part of their kids' lives? 90% of fathers agree with that. Over 80% of people, the population as a whole, regardless of age, gender, who you vote for, you're as likely to agree with this if you vote Reform as if you vote Labour, as if you vote Conservative, agree that it is better when both parents get equal opportunities to be involved in childcare rather than just one. And some other polling that another organisation did, less than 10% of people now think that a man's place is at work and a woman's place is at home looking after the kids. Like our values around gender and parenting have really moved on, but our systems have not. Our system around paternity leave hasn't been improved for 22 years. And that is ultimately a failure of the previous government, who did not prioritize this. Their solution to the problems caused by paternity leave was shared parental leave, which they brought in 2015, which allows you to transfer some maternity leave over to the father or non-birthing parent. And in theory, on paper, it sounds great. And for those who are able to take it, I hear really positive stories from people who are able to take like a really good chunk of time on shared parental leave. The problem is that almost no one uses it. It's less than 2% of families use shared parental leave. And that is because it's so poorly paid that hardly anyone can afford it. Those who do, overwhelmingly at the top of the income bracket. And also it forces people to take maternity leave away. And a lot of people aren't willing to do that because maternity leave is also important. And it's hard to sort of overstate that feeling, but you are taking this away from your partner, right? It's not something you're entitled to. It's that you're taking it from them. And other countries tried this experiment before we did. They brought in shared parental leave before proper paternity leave. It has never worked anywhere. But we tried the same thing and it hasn't worked. And so there has been some attempt to fix it, but not a proper one. And so what we need now is the political action to bring our system in line with our values and how this generation of parents wants to parent, so they're properly supported.
So we've just seen this lack of shift and change. Is that because men don't advocate for themselves very well? I've been thinking about this idea just inside of my work, inside of relationship and stuff. You know, women have learned to advocate for themselves very heavily. There's a lot of organization pushing important agendas for women. Is it just a case that men aren't used to advocating for themselves and they just kind of put up and shut with the way things are?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if this is a direct answer, but there is a real challenge in this space of the sort of recent history of activism for men's issues is quite tarnished. Like, there are groups that have campaigned in this space who've promoted this idea that benefits for men have to come at the expense of women, or the other way around, that feminism is coming at the expense of men. You know, women are gaining because men are losing. And it's a sort of profoundly misogynistic vision of men's rights that has made this space quite difficult for a lot of people to get into. And it's something we're very conscious of all the time in how we talk about, because we profoundly believe the opposite. In fact, part of the reason we want to change paternity leave is because it is good for women as well as good for men. You know, women lose out massively from the fact that they are saddled, whether or not they want to be, as the primary caregiver by default. About 75% of the gender pay gap now is caused by motherhood, because women end up in that position, and then they get to their maternity leave and they look at childcare and it's like, right, that costs more than my salary, so I guess I'm not going back to work. And that happens over and over again. And paternity leave is sort of the original sin that establishes that inequality. So like, our vision of advocacy in this space is one that's kind of in coalition with women. It's good for women and it's good for men. And there are loads of women and men who support our campaign. So whether men are less good at advocating for ourselves, I don't know. I think it's been made harder by the fact that some people have done it really badly. And I hope that there will be more campaigns like ours that come through that actually say, look, let's advocate for men in a positive way. And I'm starting to see more signs of that. Movember, who I mentioned, for example, do really great work on that in the men's health space. And I think there is a good way of doing that. And we need more of it.
Yeah, I definitely see that in my world, which is far too much of social media, of this idea like it's a zero-sum game. Like, if you are championing men, you're trying to support men, then you must be trying to take away from women. I've even had people say to me like, oh, you don't care about women. And I'm like, well, I'm confused. I'm about relationships and love and connection. Like, this is about everyone being lifted up. But there's a lot of this, I guess it's this kind of binary thinking that we have, maybe under a deal of stress, or when we become quite protective. If we see some sort of campaigning for a thing, just assuming that it's taken away from someone else, or it goes against someone else's values, which is, I find, such a shame.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I think those attitudes that sort of wariness that people will show around this stuff is reflective of a bunch of things. One is just the way that social media works and the way it forces people to talk in these very kind of, skin deep reactionary ways that's like not helpful sometimes for a kind of nuanced debate. But also, I think because a lot of what, particularly in the space around gender, a lot of what people are reading and hearing about now is the idea of masculinity promoted by Andrew Tate. And that is what, and people like him, that is what it is seen to be, to advocate for men. And so that's why, you do great work around this. We try and tread very carefully in that space to make it clear that's not what we are. But I also think it is so important that there is this kind of advocacy around men's role in society, because we've had this shift over the last 50 or 60 years ago or so, where women's role in society has really expanded. They've gone from, your role as women is to stay at home and look after the kids, clean the house, to you can have a job, you can have a career if you want. That is a really good thing. What we've not done as a society is to expand the role of men back the other way. So we've said women are now in this sphere that was seen as traditionally your masculine space, and that is no longer just a masculine space. but we haven't given you any more kind of space that you can move into that might be better suited to what you want from your life. And so what you're starting to see is people saying, well, no, the way we fix that is by pushing back and going back in the other way and saying we're reasserting our space, right? We're reestablishing masculine dominance. We're going to be stronger. We're going to buy cars. We're going to dominate women. And I've imagined very much what you believe in, and what I believe is actually the vision for what it means to have a good life as a man is built more around connection, and it's by expanding your horizons of what you can be as a man to say, do you know what, if you want to focus on your career and earn a bunch of money, great, do you. But also, if you're the kind of guy who thinks my life is going to be built around having a really close bond with my kids, or having really good friends, or being able to express myself emotionally, like that should be open to you. And that is, I think, part of what the bigger picture of what we're trying to do. And fatherhood can be such an important pillar in saying, actually, this is like a healthier version of what it means to be a man, right? That's built around fulfillment and connection, and partnership with women, not domination of them.
Yeah, I often say, I've said it in talks I've done before, where, women have had a revolution, like you said, of them, an expanded understanding of the roles that they can fulfill in society. And it's just expanded and taken up more space. And not necessarily that it's squeezed men, because I don't think it's squeezed. They almost live on two different continuums. As I'm saying this, I can think of it's like two bars where you have a graph where there'd be like kind of two bars meeting, and this side being pink and this side being blue. And a lot of people would probably think that this on the same path. So if feminism is moving women and it's squeezing men, but it's not, they're on two different sides, and women have gone, oh, great, and advocate for themselves and filled up a lot of this bar, and men's bars have stayed exactly the same or shifted a little bit, because I think there's more conversation now. And it's all this gap where there's some men kind of treading into, right, fearlessly, talking about emotions and feelings and being really involved fathers and things like that, but they're still being met with a level of ridicule, some from the men still in this blue side, and some, would you say, from kind of society at large, media and so forth. Because I always think back to, and this kind of takes me to the campaign where I became aware of yourselves. I always quote this because I think it really impacted me when I saw it, and it just kind of touched me and made me angry. I think it's when Piers Morgan was taking the piss out of Daniel Craig for wearing his child in a sling, and I really went in on him on Twitter. And I always think of moments like that because with my kind of confidence in myself and being the man I am, I look at that and go, Piers Morgan, you're a bit of a dick. It's really unnecessary. But Piers Morgan has, I don't know how many followers on Twitter, X, whatever people call it. I'm not really a big fan on the platform. He has, millions of people would have viewed that. Millions of men would have viewed that. And they would have thought, I don't want anyone to take the piss out of me in this way. I don't want my friends to judge me in this way, right? Whether they think it consciously or unconsciously, which would stop them from ever wearing their children in a sling, And so much so, if the people, I'm almost rebellious in this way, the people that live around where I am, I take my little boy for a walk pretty much every morning, and have done since he was about 4 weeks old. So there's people around here that know me as a man who's always got his son in a sling and carrying him walking through the forest, and they talk to me and they say hello. But I always think of maybe the men who are in my NCT class or other men around who will never take that experience up because of the fear of what other people might think of them.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And it's all part of this sort of soup of culture and policy, like the kind of systemic barriers. I mean, going back to the Piers Morgan example briefly, I, funnily enough, was asked about that specific example. I was giving evidence in Parliament a couple of months ago, and they asked, what about this? My answer to that is always the same, which is, like, to be honest, I will take my cues on masculinity from James Bond and not from Piers Morgan. And so that's kind of what I like about that example is, yes, on the one hand, you've got a powerful figure ridiculing someone for carrying a baby in a sling, but on the other hand, it sort of holds up a lens of like, yeah, but this is literally James Bond and yours Piers Morgan. Like, what is masculinity here, really? Who's given me the better steer on how I should be a man? So yeah, I mean those cultural barriers definitely do exist, and I think there's a huge amount of variability in some workforces. We hear sort of awful stories about the discrimination that people face, and for example, we did some work on the police a few months ago because there's tons of problems with paternity leave in the police. Like most officers can't afford to take even 2 weeks. They go back after a week and they're sleep deprived, driving their police cars at high speed and holding tasers and guns. And, it's not great for anyone. But one guy said, I took an extra 2 weeks off because my partner had a C-section. So I took my 2 weeks paternity leave. I took 2 weeks unpaid to look after her because it takes 6 weeks sometimes for you to recover. And I went back and I was mocked. I was ostracized. People were making fun of me behind my back. And said it was one of the reasons he ended up leaving the police, because it was just, he had no support. And then in other places you hear about companies who are brilliant and cultures that entirely encourage you to be an open, active father. But like one of the things in this one of the things that's so powerful about things like paternity leave is the evidence from other countries is that if you can shift some of those systemic barriers, you drive behavior change, and that behavior change drives cultural change. So you look at Iceland, for example. The Scandinavian countries tend to do paternity leave best, not surprisingly. And Iceland brought in 3 months of paternity leave in 2000. So at the time, it was the best paternity leave policy in the world. And before that, they had done what we had done. They just offered shared parental leave, and literally no one was using it. Like there was 1 year where in the whole of Iceland, 8 men, not 8%, 8 individual men took some form of parental leave. I mean, it's not a huge country, but that's incredible. They could sort of not even form a football team together. And so they brought in this paternity leave, and then literally overnight, it went from less than 1% to 80%. And then within 7 years, you had got to a place where they track what percentage of couples share childcare equally once a child is age 3 or older. That had risen to 80%, and had been at something like 30% before they brought in paternity leave. And of course, that then drives cultural barriers. Of course, it changes the norms around how it is to parent. And I've spoken to people in Sweden who do great paternity leave. They have for a long time, and they say it's the opposite. You are not are you frowned upon for being active. If you didn't take your paternity leave and weren't active as a father, you're ostracized the other way. You're seen as kind of beyond the pale for not playing that role. And you can't change those things unless you change this. The policies are like literal walls in the way of cultural change. You have to knock those down before things will start to shift, because otherwise people's behavior can't change.
Yeah, people don't have the economic means or space to make those changes. And it's really interesting we said about police, because one of my questions is like, I can think back to maybe would have been in my early career when I first started working maybe 20 years ago. And one of the guys in the office, I worked in tech for about 16 years, and he was taking paternity leave, and his boss was kind of mocking him. He was like, well, you're going on holiday? Where are you going to go on holiday? You've got these 2 weeks. What are you going to do? Put your feet up, watch a bit of TV, watch some football. And I remember thinking at that time, even as young as I was there, like, what the fuck? Come on, this is mad. But then now I talk to my friends now who, especially in the last few years, quite a few people have been having children, and like everyone maxing out paternity leave, but, coming up against the 2 weeks, or some people are in better company, so they get like 3 months, or I think a friend of mine was able to split the 3 months in two, take 6 weeks to start with, and then take the 6 weeks at a later date during the first year, which I think was a really beautiful system. But it is this, I do sometimes wonder, like, especially in some of these finance organizations and sales organizations where they kind of maybe are more, they have a more kind of competition and domination culture, where ridicule and banter it has to be part of it. Men are still feeling the pressure not to take it, feeling like they can't, that it somehow is unmanly even to kind of take paternity leave.
Yeah, we definitely hear that from people, and in particularly finance, law. They're sort of well-paid, competitive, very like demanding professions are somewhere there's the irony of they're the most likely to offer very generous paternity leave because the competition for good staff is fierce and because they can afford it, whereas smaller businesses in other less wealthy sectors probably can't. But they're also some of the industries where people are most reluctant to take it because they have that fear that, like, wink, wink, you can take it, but we know really, like, you're going to lose out if you do. And actually, we did some polling not that long ago that over 50% of men said, I would be worried about my career if I took my full paternity leave.
Wow.
So, it is not enough to bring in as a company a good paternity leave policy, pat yourself on the back and then leave it there. You have to do all sorts of work within your organization to change your culture. And equally, this is part of why we don't think ultimately this should be up to companies to fix it. Like, there are two reasons for that. One is not everyone can afford it. It's too expensive for a lot of tiny companies to offer decent paternity leave. And at the moment, paternity leave is paid for by the government primarily, and it should continue to be. We need to make sure that it's not this sort of two-tier lottery system, which we have now, where if you work at BT, great, you get 6 months full pay. You work at, your local coffee shop, you get 2 weeks if you're lucky. So we need the government to make sure that it's fair for everyone. But also because individual businesses can only do so much to drive cultural change. They have control over people's experience within their company, but you need a society-wide systemic change in the horizons that we open up for men to play a bigger role in childcare. And you can't do that in pockets of wealthy industries here and there or good companies here and there. It has to be across the board.
Yeah, definitely. And there's something that popped into my head as you're speaking. It's somewhat connected, somewhat. It's actually football. Because I distinctly remember, footballers not attending the birth of their child to play a game. And it's something I feel like I've started to shift, because maybe something I'm really paying attention to now after I've had my own baby and been through that birthing experience, which is like kind of this, it's almost like a strange psychedelic experience. You kind of go into it and it's really intense, and you come out and you're like, oh, I have this baby with me, and oh, what just happened over the last few days? But I got no time to really think about it because I've got a baby to look after. And I guess I wonder if something that you know much about is obviously footballers don't get paternity leave. No one's don't get paternity leave. And even I've seen it mentioned, and I'm an Arsenal supporter, so it's something I've been noticing around Martin Odegaard and his child being born. I think it was at the back end of last year. And even the commentary sometimes has been like, oh yeah, but his form has dipped, but he did have a baby and maybe that's affecting his form, which I guess could definitely be a reason. But I guess around the footballers, like have within the sport, if it's something you notice or something you follow, the attitude around fatherhood started to shift in the sport, because I'm hearing less and less of, so I'm hearing more and more, so-and-so's not playing today because their child was born yesterday or they're about to be born.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I like, I'm a cricket fan, and I've noticed that over the last few years in cricket, is pretty standard now. You hear like, oh, X is missing this game to attend the birth of their child, or that they've flown back from the tour of Australia to be at the birth of their child, which sounds like a kind of bare minimum, right? But you're right, like it hasn't necessarily been that way in football. And even again, I follow Formula One, and Max Verstappen, who's the sort of the champion, the best driver around, has just had a baby, and he's days afterwards, he's driving a car at 200 miles an hour, risking his life. I mean, he's better than ever. He's won the last, he's been winning everything. So maybe that's the opposite. But yeah, sportsmen are in an interesting space in this. And it is wild when you think about it, that there isn't even the space to be like, okay, just miss a couple of games. We're not necessarily, maybe you don't even get the pay. Like, to be honest, I'm not that bothered whether footballers get paid or not. They get a lot of money, but like, to have that space. But it reminds me of a conversation I was having the other day, actually, with someone from an organization called Dance Mama, which represents people in dance, about parenting. And she was talking about men in dance, and a lot of them are self-employed, not particularly well-paid industry. So you have lots of guys who have a baby and then are back to work like immediately. And she sort of talks about this guy who was like, he was just 4 coffees before he went out. And can you imagine trying to dance around on stage and jump and be energetic when you've like not slept at all? So I can kind of imagine how it would impact a footballer if they are playing any kind of role whatsoever in looking after the baby after they're born.
Yeah, especially if there could be all sorts of complications we don't know about, that post, first few months where, you have no idea what you're doing. Neither of you have done this before. So if you're first, you've never done this before. So every little cough and runny nose, you're like concerned and worried. Is it a fever? You're getting out that little gun thing that we have now.
Yeah.
That they put in the ear. And, if you do, your child is a bit unwell, it's going to affect you at work, and that's something that I think is really affecting the situation is the way that I think it's something you talked about earlier, is that because a mother becomes the primary caregiver, once they do go back to work, they then become the primary person for calls or sicknesses to take time off. And I guess I'm getting into the thing I was thinking about after that is like the gender pay gap, because I read Richard Reeves' book of Boys and Men, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book. But and he makes a really strong case for the gender pay gap predominantly being about parenthood or motherhood, like a motherhood tax almost that is put on. Do you see paternity leave as one of the kind of antidotes to that gender pay gap?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, starting with the evidence around it, there's an analysis that countries that offer 6 weeks of paternity leave or more have a 4% lower gender pay gap. Just on that alone, there was a study in Sweden that for every extra month of paternity leave the father took, the mother's earnings over time went up by 7%. And that is because paternity leave is that, like, as I say, that sort of original cornerstone that cements that primary caregiver, primary breadwinner role, whether or not that's what the family wants. Because you think about it, you're there for 2 weeks or less if you can't afford that full time, and plenty of people can't. And you're just starting to get, your head round how to do this parenting thing, and you're not away, you're not sleeping. And like, we hear from so many people who said the first week of my paternity leave we spent in hospital because it was a difficult birth and we needed neonatal care, and then I was gone. That was it. I didn't get anything. And so after that, even, with all the best will in the world, you want to be as involved as you can be. Over time, of course, it's the mother who learns how to feed the child properly, how to change them when they're starting on solids. What do they like? What do they don't like? How do you cut stuff? Where do you keep things? And of course, the child becomes more bonded to them. So when they're unhappy, they want to go to them. And you sort of become this sort of beta parent, right, as the father. And it's very hard for that not to happen. And so when you then get to the point where you're trying to work out how do you do, we're at the end of our parental leave, we're trying to work out how we do this longer term, and you have lack of flexible working, you have incredibly expensive childcare, would make it very difficult for both parents to juggle working fully and parenting. And so one parent has to go part-time or leave work altogether. It's almost always the mother. Like, it's very difficult to push against those forces, even if that's never what you planned. And that starts right from the beginning. So it's crucial to bring down the gender pay gap. And it's also crucial in the sense that because we have this inequality, employers are aware that if they hire a woman aged between, say, 25 and 40, there's a good chance they will have a baby in the next few years. And for them, that means they'll be gone for a year, and there's a prejudice that if they come back, they'll have baby brain, they won't be as useful, their heads will be at home. Whereas to men, you're like, yeah, okay, if they have a baby, they'll be gone 2 weeks. It won't cost me anything, like, big deal. And so, employers too many employers secretly admit, I wouldn't hire a woman in that age range, or I don't promote women in that age range. And Pregnant and Screw did research recently. It was 74,000 women a year lose their jobs for becoming pregnant. Essentially, it's not legal, but it happens. And until you make it so that it is more normal for men to play a bigger role, so that the kind of cost differential for companies is lower, that prejudice will continue to happen. And that discrimination and that sort of step back at work that women have to make when they have children and ripples out for the rest of their life. It's part of why you end up with so few women in the boardroom, because their careers are set back by a decade. And then when they retire, you have tons of women falling into pensioner poverty because they stop paying in to their pensions, and so they got a tiny pension when they retire. So it's a massive problem. And yeah, paternity leave is the acorn at the core of that problem. It's not the whole solution, but it's quite hard to fix it without fixing that first.
Yeah. I definitely see that. Even just, I've got friends who have risen to, shall we say, very senior positions in companies. And it's openly discussed, like, oh, we've got this candidate, we've got this another senior position. And yeah, we interviewed her. She's married. She has no children. She's 35.
Yeah.
Like, what are we going to do? Because that's going to be something we'd have to do over the next 5 years. Or companies, I know of people who went on maternity leave and were paid off to leave. Or they came back and they had to come to some sort of settlement because, companies didn't feel they had their eye fully on the ball. Or if I go back to my early days, I had an old boss. He was just like, I'm not even interviewing them. That was his thing. He's like, I'm not even interviewing them. If she's like 25 to 35, I'm not interviewing. 35 to 40, I'm not interviewing them. I'm just not. We had this real big gap where we had these women who were like 23 out of uni type of thing, and a few women who are in their kind of 50s and 60s working in the team. And obviously I'm going back 20 years, but this is, I don't know how much is still laying over. And obviously the percentage of this is happening is on down, but it was like never written down anywhere, just discussed in pubs and post interview meetings and so forth. And it is incredibly sad that that's what a lot of women are up against, for simply doing something that our government actually really wants them to do. They really want you to have children because, population shrinkage and so forth. But yet their infrastructure isn't there. And then there's the kind of mindset and beliefs that's probably still hanging around in a lot of companies, probably especially in the, so we say, older age groups, or those people in the most power in a lot of companies as well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think it's so telling that you're one person and you've just told me, I think, 3 different anecdotes about different instances where you've either seen this or heard someone talking about this. Yeah, I mean, it's completely rife. And I think that point you make about the government wants women to do this is a valuable one, because I met some folks from Baby Bjorn a few months ago, the baby sling brand, because they were interested in our stunt. And their founder Bjorn was a kind of advocate for better paternity leave back in the day. And they said we were talking about Sweden's journey through better paternity leave, and they started doing this in the 70s. They're decades ahead of us. And something they said that was really interesting, that kind of stuck with me, is like I've always assumed that Scandinavia is this kind of it's all built on their ideals, the kind of Scandinavian ideal of equality and gender equality. And they're like, yeah, we do care about that. But they started doing this because they needed women to go to work. Like they started doing this because they needed economic growth. Like, it wasn't an ideological thing to start with. And that is the case here, that the fact that we make it so difficult for women to have children and then contribute at work in the way many want, it's like really bad for our economy, if you want to put it in those kind of spreadsheet terms. And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation did some modeling recently based on all the data from all these other countries. It's the one good thing about being the worst, is that you've got evidence from how it's played out everywhere else. And they found that if we increased our paternity leave to 6 weeks, paid at 90%, which is what you get in the first bit of maternity leave, that by making it easier for women to go back to work longer term, not like cutting their maternity leave short, but saying, yeah, I'm gonna go back to work, maybe an extra day a week than I might have done, or I'm not gonna quit my job because it's easier to share things at home, that you generate about £13 in growth for every pound that it costs the Treasury, because those women go back to work, they pay taxes, so it actually doesn't cost that much. And then being at work means they can produce stuff for the economy, and it generates like £2.6 billion in growth, costs us about £200 million in taxes. Like it's just a no-brainer. And that's before You talk about any of the outside benefits you would get to saving the NHS on the costs of mental health provision for parents. So PricewaterhouseCoopers, big management consultancy, did a model, and they suggest that better paternity leave would save half a million parents from getting postnatal depression over the next 20 years, save the NHS
Wow.
about £1.4 billion. So that's mental health. Then there's the benefits you would get from kids. There's really good evidence. In fact, there's a study on the government's own website. If children are closer to their fathers, they are happier, they do better at school, they have better emotional development. So you're saving money there in kids who might not have behavioral problems that you need to deal with in the system, and they'll grow up to be happier, more productive members of our society. Like, if you want to talk about this in economic terms, it is core economic infrastructure that every other country in Europe has recognized is essential to a proper functioning modern economy, and we have not. And we expect parents to perform that impossible juggle themselves, and we're all losing out as a result. It's not just parents, but society as a whole and our economy as a whole is losing out.
And I guess the question comes is like, what's the pushback? If it feels like such a no-brainer idea, right, that we offer like more paternity leave, what's the pushback and even the kind of reasons for the pushback that you experience?
There's a few bits of pushback we get. I mean, so on the whole, most people are very supportive of this. Like, that's all the evidence is there. But you do get pushback. So it ranges from, this is a kind of unacceptable burden on business. And I think sometimes that comes from a misunderstanding of who pays for it. And again, we're saying government should pay for this as they do in most places in Europe, as we do now. But also, the idea that if you have to cover for someone for 6 weeks, that's really onerous. I think businesses can handle it. And in fact, what you see is, as we talked about, more and more businesses are offering it themselves, both because they want to recruit and retain the best staff, but also because increasingly they know that if you drag someone back to work after a week or two who's knackered, whose world's been turned upside down, they're not a productive member of your team. Like, the idea you can work 100% is a fantasy. And I hear from people who are like, yeah, I just went back and everyone knows you go back and you do the bare minimum. You just like coast by. You're not really there. Your head's elsewhere. Like, of course, that's how it works. How could it not work that way? And at the same time, you are you're rolling the dice. It's 45% of dads experiencing symptoms of postnatal depression. You're literally flipping a coin on that employee by saying, back to work 100%, go for it. In 3 months' time, they may be off sick. That's not good for you either as an employer, and they'll resent you for it. I hear all the time from people who said, I was treated badly around that time. My employer didn't give me an extra couple of weeks and I really needed them, and I left because I couldn't forgive them for it. So it's not actually bad for companies. It's something that we think on the whole companies would benefit from. The second bit of pushback we get sometimes is kind of from perhaps a previous generation said, well, we didn't get this and we were fine. Which I actually have a lot of sympathy for. Like, it's, if you went through that experience and you can say, well, I don't understand why is it different these days? People have parented in this way for thousands of years, right? Like, men have been out earning the money for thousands of years. Like, why does this need to change now? And the reality is that the societal change we've gone through in the last decade or two is massive. And that's not just the shift in gender roles that we were talking about earlier. It's also economically. Like, if you go back to our grandparents' generation, you could have an average standard of living on one salary. And today that is very, very difficult, right? Like, you to get by, you need two people to work. And if you sort of somehow expect two people to work, but mums to do all the childcare and also to be offered maternity leave, but not really paid to be offered maternity leave. And it's a system that's not designed for modern realities about how families can support themselves and the shifts in how you parent that need to come alongside that. And at the same time, we've had a big shift away from sort of, it takes a village style parenting, community-based parenting, extended family, to much more isolated nuclear families. That's much more common. It's more common that you moved away from your parents. It's more common that you don't have your neighbors helping you out. And so a lot more pressure is placed on the parents. And if you don't allow fathers to take on more of that pressure, like you're breaking mothers and you're excluding fathers who want to be there. And then the final bit of pushback we get is people who say things like, it's your choice to have kids, you pay for them. And I think that's like, on the one hand, I think that reveals this idea that we've got into as of children was almost like a burden on our society, and not as like literally the lifeblood and future of everything. Our birth rate has fallen through the floor over the last decade. We were at 2 kids per couple. It's now 1.4 kids per couple. And you only need to look around the world at countries like Japan to see what what an aging society looks like. And it's not good, right? It's not what we want. And it's also, children are just like fundamental. I feel like we've got into this space that other countries haven't, where we see them as getting in the way of almost fulfilling our like capitalist purpose as a society, to go out, work hard, bring in money. It's like, actually, what really matters here is family and relationships and connection. And we are not focused enough in society on making that possible for people. And one thing on that I think is really interesting that I've discovered from doing this is that is not, and this whole issue area is not some kind of, it's sometimes caricatures as a kind of metropolitan middle-class dads who are into this, but it's not actually. The evidence we have is that when you ask people about, what makes a good man, is it going out and earning a bunch of money or being there for their family, or what's most important to you in life? Is it that you could get more time with your family or achieve more at work? It's actually people on the lowest incomes from working class backgrounds who are more likely to say the most important thing is my family and getting that time. So I think we do have widespread support for this, but you get some of these, you do get these isolated points of pushback, and I think it's fine. I can understand where people are coming from, but I think we have good answers.
Yeah, very strong answers. Yeah, really strong answers. And I guess we're seeing, with the birth rates dropping, we're seeing people are just opting out of having kids. There's a lot of people, I've got friends and family who just chosen not to. Some it was a choice, and some it wasn't so much of a choice for them of not having children. And there's an impact. He said there's an impact on the country in the long term and all sorts of things. A bit like seeing kids as this like luxury or like a burden, like, oh, well, you had kids, that's your problem to deal with, isn't really in the spirit of community. And I guess it's this kind of like individualism starting to creep in, like, oh, it's not my problem. Because I'm thinking of, it's a book I read a little while ago. It might be a bit of a tenuous link. Psychology of Money. And it's a book that you're familiar with or heard about. No. So in the book, at the appendix right at the end, there's an American author, and he's talking about America, and he's talking about how after World War II, there was just like a general increase in economic prosperity, and it was shared across society, right? No one questioned it. It was just shared across society. All Americans got wealthier and richer. Obviously there's always a few at the bottom who don't, and a very few at the top that got richer. But he said, as a general, everyone got richer together. And he said in the 80s, there was a sudden flip, a sudden flip where the wealthy got really, really rich and the poorer got poorer. And we just kind of accepted it. And I wonder if it's kind of a similar thing with the kind of like having children and nurturing children and society being responsible for children, that there's this like, it just shifts into this individualism, this selfishness of like, well, that's your problem. Mm-hmm. I'm dealing with my problems and you deal with yours. And I don't really want to hear about your problems too much. You find a way to solve those, in the way that people kind of push back on this, which is like a fundamentally good idea for everybody that's having children and not having children.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. It feels rooted in a very individualistic view of society rather than a community-based view of society. I also think there is probably as well some tie-in with, the stuff that was prevalent in our politics, particularly sort of 10, 15 years ago, this idea of benefit scroungers and this sort of parody of, women having 10 kids so they could get benefits for each child. And like, it was never really true. Like, you could find the odd instance, but, something that's completely counter to that narrative is There's a great newsletter if you're interested in this kind of stuff called Boom, which is about the declining birth rate and what we can do about it. And one of the writer of that newsletter I spoke to, and she pointed out to me that now you are far more likely to have children within Western societies like ours. You're far more likely to have children if you're wealthier than if you're poorer, which flips the kind of historical trend on its head. But we've got to a place now where it's so expensive to have children that people who want to have children don't do it because they can't afford it. So like far away from this idea of people who can't afford children having them to like leech off the state, we are stopping people who want them from having them. And it has become a luxury for a lot of people to have children. And I think that is something that should really concern us as a society, both as a basic kind of social fairness thing, but also because, again, like children are literally the lifeblood of not just our economy, but of our culture and our society. And, you know, I don't want to live in a world where everyone is 90. Like that sucks. And I want to, when I'm old, I want to be surrounded by my neighbors' kids. And yeah, it feels in the sad. I don't think it's majority viewpoint, but I think it's more prevalent than I'd like it to be, that's not, children are not seen as a collective good for society.
Yeah. It reminds me of that movie, is it Children of Men? Where there's no one's having children, no one can have children anymore. And like the last child that was born is like 18 years old. And people are just despairing in society. You know, euthanasia is like, you can be sent pills to take your own life if you choose to. And it's quite a dystopian movie, really beautiful movie. I watched it years and years ago. But like, is this the point where we're going to get to where I do wonder though, like where becomes the kind of rock bottom of this, this piece, not just about paternity, but the kind of wider thing about people not having children, because there'll come a point where, you know, someone in power will be like, we really need to do something. Like I know Donald Trump is talking about some ridiculous ideas, you know, paying trad wife influencers to, you know, glorify their lives and offering like talking about offering baby bonuses, like all the things that would appear to make it good, but you know, because you know the states are even worse when it comes to paternity leave, maternity leave, and so forth. But like I just wonder where the bottom is, where we go, oh, actually, we really need to do something about this instead of like just leaving it and hoping that someone else will sort out the problem. Or that, you know, I always, in my mind, have been, I studied geography at A-level, so I kind of learned about this declining birth rate even from, you know, that was over 20 years ago. I was at school. And like how immigration is used to basically top that up and push that up, because immigrants, they come into the country, they're more likely to have children, certain, you know, I always wonder to myself, I got a lot of friends who are Muslim, and I always wonder to myself, I'm like, man, if you remove Muslims and like Hindus and Sikhs from the British population and the child birthing population, let's take Africans away as well, because they like having kids too. I could say this, I've got African family. I'm like, man, the birth rate must be incredibly low amongst what we kind of, you know, Mr. Farage would call kind of white British people. It must be in like really, really low amongst different demographics must have even lower birth rates, because, you know, some cultures are lean towards having more children and having more family and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, because where's the bottom here? And I guess, yeah, this is kind of thinking out loud.
No, that's a really interesting point. Yeah. And you're totally right. Like the sort of, the whole system has been propped up by immigration, you know, letting other countries have the babies and then hoping they come over here. And that trend is only going to get sharper from what I understand. And like, I think I think things like paternity leave have a role to play here, but I think it's perhaps more of an indirect role. Like, as far as I understand it, the evidence is not sort of one-to-one that if you offer family-friendly policies, birth rates will increase. In fact, the countries that offer the most generous paternity leave in the world are South Korea and Japan, and they do it because their birth rates are really, really low, and it hasn't really massively shifted the dial. But I think some theories that I've heard around this that are really interesting are that essentially the way parenting is now is way too expensive and way too exhausting, and people see that, and it makes people want to have children less. And so part of how we counteract that and say, look, yeah, sure, every parent knows you give stuff up to be a parent. Every parent knows parenting is hard work, but like, we're going to support you properly if you do this. It's not going to, there was this comment from Chapel Rowan, who she got sort of slaughtered for this, but she said, I don't want to have kids. Like, none of my friends who have children under the age of 5 have any light behind their eyes. And it's like, if that, I was like, that rings too true.
Yeah.
But like, if that's how people see parenting, that's a problem, and we need to change that, because it is. I'm sure you have the same experience as I do. Like, it's a total joy. It's like the most fulfilling thing I've ever done in my life. It's incredibly hard work, but it's also like, I wouldn't want a life without it. But if what people see from the outside is like, that's going to ruin my life because it's such hard work and I'm not going to be properly supported, and it will mean I'm broke, like, of course people are going to choose or think twice about doing it.
Yeah, I wonder if we just become so acutely aware of that, the pain. And I think I was listening to this in another podcast, and I can't remember where it was. It was one of those podcasts where they were calling all young people fragile. But young people not wanting to have children because of the pain and the difficulty of it. Plus, we're so aware of it, I think, now. Like, and there's so many. I also think that what we see is there's so many other options. There's other lifestyles, I think I look back to my mum, and my mum, there's like, she's got 4 kids, and everyone she knows has children. Like, I can think of like maybe one of her friends over the years, and we're talking like over the last 30 years of my life, can I think of that she had a good friend that didn't have kids? All of them have kids. It's just something you do. Where are we kind of one of the first generations that's like, you choose whether you have kids or not. It's not just an expectation. And we can see what life looks like when you don't have kids, and it can look, and I don't know if it's deliberately been made to look really glorious, but it can also be quite, because I'm sitting here thinking, sometimes me and my partner, we sit down and go, imagine we didn't have our little boy's called Bjorn as well. Imagine we didn't have him, and be like, oh my God, we'd be partying in the Maldives, and we would have done this thing and that thing and so forth, because you can really see the lives in front of you, whether it's through celebrity, whether it's through friends of friends. And then there's the kind of financial burden. I wonder if it's like parenting needs a really good PR campaign, Someone in government needs to really be like, we need a good PR campaign. We can't just rely on the fact that kids bring you really lots of joy, because if people looking into it, all they see is tiredness, stress, worry, sickness.
Yeah.
Like, there needs to be a big shift in how, like you said, how we view parenting from the outside.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. Like that PR campaign. I think it's really revealing that, as you say, our generation, it's become more of a choice, and also people are delaying having children, right? Like, that's a big thing that I at least felt that for my generation, and I think we're the same generation, we were definitely taught your fulfillment will come from your career, right? That was very much the message I remember being brought up, is like, the world's your oyster. You're growing up in the 90s, the economy's going through the roof, like, everything's great. You can go out there and get a great job, and that's how you're going to be happy and fulfilled. And something I'm finding interesting is seeing people of my generation who we all kind of went in with that. More and more of them are saying, like, actually, I don't think that is where I'm getting my fulfillment from. Actually, I think it's from, I wanted to have a family, and I think it's from that's where they've landed. But they're getting there sort of early to mid 30s. And yeah, I think we almost, in a way, as a society, we've had to go through that journey of saying, look, there are options outside of family, because it's part of how we've freed women, actually. Like, all the steps we've taken to free women economically, sort of almost had to go through that and say, look, you can have fulfillment outside of family too. But I sometimes wonder if we've, as you say, we've stopped pinning family up as just like a really good thing, right? As a something to aspire to have a good life for a lot of people. And of course, you can have a good life without having family, and it's a much better place that people can choose that for themselves. But yeah, it's good PR campaign. Sounds like a smart idea.
Yeah.
I'd recommend it to
everyone. Because I'm seeing this even, in my work around kind of relationship and masculinity and even personal development, where even the emergence of the kind of trad wife, right, is kind of part of it, in that there's this pushback on for a lot of women that I know from who did do the career thing, who did go like, okay, let's go. Career is the only thing. It's most important. Create the freedom. And then, like you said, realizing like, actually, this isn't actually fulfilling. This is really horrible for me, or that it's really destructive to me. And then deciding want to have a family. And I'm seeing the same even with men, man. I think maybe we are seeing a kind of pendulum move. And that, like listeners, I'm not thinking that the whole trad wife thing is good or bad. I think that, just to say this, because I feel like I always have to kind of caveat myself, it's like, it's about choice. It's about doing the thing that you actually want to do. If you want to go and have 17 children and live on a ranch somewhere, like, go do you, man. Be happy. And if you want to be the CEO of a multinational billion-dollar company, you go do that too. But do it from your own kind of decision. But I think we're seeing a kind of shift away from my career's going to be everything and moving in the other direction. I think we're also seeing it in the kind of sphere of masculinity, of like men decoupling a bit from their whole identity being their status, their work status. And obviously this is going to be a thing that kind of takes forever to do. But we're seeing I'm seeing it in the men that I'm working with, who are being like, well, actually, when I do have kids, I want to create a business, or I want to create a life so that I can really be there for them in the way that my parents were, my father was. I think that's a big driving force I see for a lot of men. And if I'm honest, it's been a huge driving force for me in my life, of being like, how can I be a much better father than mine? Not just a little bit. Like, I'm a considerably better father than my father was. What do I need to do in my life to create that dynamic that I'm actually really there and present? Like, my big thing's been like, well, when my little boy is old enough and he wants to go and play football and he wants to do all these bits and pieces, I want to be able to take him there and pick him up. That's something that's really important. I'm going to take him there and pick him up, whether it's Saturday, Sunday, a Monday, Tuesday. And I think I'm seeing this shift in a lot of the kind of men that I'm coming across, away from being like, yeah, that's what in my early career. Oh yeah, that's what my wife will do. Tonight, no, I want to be there on the sidelines. I want to be really involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of that shift that we are, I'm talking about trying to, fatherhood is a pillar of a different vision for what a good life as a man can be. I think that's exactly what you're describing. And, we see the fact that men have been locked out of that kind of connection, both in family, but the ability to express themselves emotionally in other spheres. Like, the impact of that is in the data. It's not it's not the qualitative thing. It's the 3 out of 4 suicides are men. That suicide is the leading cause of death under the men of men under the age of 50. And the depression is higher in men than it is in women. These are not, it's not good for men, this system we've created. And I think it's really positive, the shift you're describing, that it's starting, we're nowhere near where we need to be, but it's starting to be more acceptable for men to be more expressive. It's more acceptable for men to say, I want connection as the kind of founding principle of my life, and connection with my kids to be the kind of bedrock of my fulfillment. One of the MPs we work with on the campaign put it in terms of like, for my generation, it's cool to be a good parent. Like, it's cool to be a good dad. And I think that's like, maybe that's part of the pendulum shift you're talking about. I also think, like, to your point around choice, that's very much how we see what we're doing. Like, I believe a good way to parent is to try and do it equally. I really don't believe that what I'm doing is trying to push that ideal on other people. What we have at the moment is a system through things like bad paternity leave that stops people from having choice. And what I want to create is a system where it's not about your gender that determines what you do. It's about what works for you as a family. And if that is, you're going to be a trad wife and the dad's going to go and work 60-hour weeks and everyone's really happy, great. But that should be your choice, not forced upon you. And at the moment, our system robs people of choice.
Yeah, definitely robs people of choice. most people other than the wealthiest in our society when it comes to this. This has been I could probably have another million questions, and I'm not going to keep on going because I think I love the, obviously, you're so well steeped in this and understanding the various aspects, not just the statistics and how it affects people, but also, the things that are on the outer periphery, like the masculinity, and all these things. It's been such a fascinating conversation for me. So if someone's listening to us, the listeners, how can they support you? How can they make a difference in paternity leave in the UK?
So if people want to support the campaign, the best thing to do is go to our website, which is dadshift.org.uk, and there'll be a button there to add your name to back better paternity leave. Do that. It helps show the government that you want action on this. And then also we can then follow up with you of all the different kind of actions we're doing over time. There's a big moment coming up this summer where the government is going to review parental leave. That was a manifesto commitment. They said they're going to do it. That's a really big, like, once in a generation opportunity to actually win better paternity leave. So if you come, sign up, get on the list, and then we'll contact you when that happens, and there'll be a ton of stuff for you to do. If you're on social media, we're at Dadshift UK, and liking, commenting, sharing is super helpful. It helps us reach more people with the campaign and our message.
Fantastic. And yeah, listeners, if you haven't popped over to Dadshift's Instagram, pop over and have a look at, in particularly, the campaign. But it became clear to me what you were doing when you put slings and all these statues around London. I think probably, the first one on the picture is Thierry Henry's statue outside the Emirates Stadium, which definitely piqued my interest. And I think it actually is around the time that I learned to tie the sling as well. Every day I'm tying that sling. So listeners, definitely get over and put your name down, and also share this with a man, a woman, anyone you know who's been affected by paternity leave, which basically is probably a lot of the people in your life. And even if you're not in the UK, because I know I've got a lot of US listeners, there's going to be an organization that's trying to do exactly the same thing as Dadshift over in the US, because you guys have even worse paternity leave. I think you're like close to the bottom in the whole world when it comes to paternity and maternity leave. So please do share this with somebody who can hear that, the struggles of being a dad, and can maybe make some changes within their own workplace, or even people who work in government, who can really start to push this themselves as well. So I want to say a big thank you to Alex for such a riveting conversation. Super grateful for what you're doing, and also just to talk to you today. And listeners, thank you for listening. And I say ciao, ciao.